Hello, and welcome to the fifth topic in Fundamentals of Contract Law, the requirement for certainty. Before you listen to this, you should have read Chapter 6 of your textbook and your casebook, had to think about what the issues are, maybe made a note of some of the questions that you have, listen out for them, or the answers to those questions in this recording, and bring those to class or raise them on the discussion board. Essentially, certainty is a broad catch-all term here that covers a number of different concepts. An agreement can only be made if the meeting of the minds, the consensus ad idem between the parties, is both sufficiently certain and not incomplete. This doesn't mean that every possibility needs to be addressed, that every potential risk or term or interest of the parties needs to be documented. But it does mean that it needs to be clear and certain as to what the respective rights and obligations of the parties will be. That is what is meant by certainty. Completeness, on the other hand, requires that all the essential elements are addressed. And we'll look at what essential items and essential terms are as we move through. Why do we look at the question of certainty, or why do we keep breaking these things up? Remember that the goal here ultimately is not that you know everything there is to know about each of the formation elements, but that you can solve problems about contracts, which includes also problems about writing contracts, as well as identifying whether a contract exists. So what we're really doing today is finishing up this idea or this question of whether there is a contract or not. The other things on this slide: who can sue? Are there other ways of getting enforcement? What are the terms of the contract if one exists, and how do you understand or construe those terms? And what the parties' specific rights and obligations are. These are things that will follow on from this discussion. But what we're really focusing on here is understanding what the key elements of a formation of a contract are, so we can identify whether there is a contract. We can answer that question: is there a contract, or has a contract been formed? And just to remind you, the key elements are agreement. Really, that's asking the question, have the parties reached agreement? Agreement is made up of offer and acceptance, but there are times when we identify it not out of a clear offer that is immediately accepted on its terms without modification, but by looking at all of the circumstances, applying an objective test. We need to identify whether or not the parties have struck a bargain. Is there a quid pro quo? Are the benefit, detriment, and the bargain elements, which we call consideration, have they been achieved? Next, we ask ourselves, did the parties intend legal consequences? Even if those other things are there, could it be that this is just a social or domestic arrangement that nobody ever had any intention of enforcing? And lastly, what we're going to cover off today is that question of whether there are clearly identified rights and responsibilities. Is there certainty? Is the arrangement complete? Certainty itself comprises three elements. In order to be certain as a matter of law, the agreement must be sufficiently certain, sufficiently complete, and lastly, not illusory. All three of those things must be there in order to give rise to an enforceable contract. The requirements themselves are often termed collectively as the certainty requirement. That's what we're doing in this topic. However, they really do refer to these three different subtopics, and I'm going to talk about each of them separately, one by one, over the next couple of mini videos. Before we really get there to the individual components, I want to talk briefly about what certainty is not. It isn't necessary for the parties to provide for every possible contingency in the terms or to articulate the terms so clearly that they can only be interpreted in one way. Courts will resolve ambiguities in documents, and they will fill in the gaps to a certain extent, but what they won't do is put in a term that isn't there. They won't create or write a contract for the parties. So before we move on, I want to just give you this kind of overview, and what we'll do in each of the little mini videos that are going to follow here is I'm going to talk about each of these areas. We're going to start with this idea of whether a contract is sufficiently complete, and we're going to look at what happens there. We're then going to talk about what happens if a agreement is vague or ambiguous. And we're going to then move on to talk about what is meant by an illusory promise. Now, some of these things we've covered in previous topics to an extent, so we're going to fly through them pretty quickly, but I just want to unpack them for you one by one so we can talk about them in a meaningful way. Once we understand what each of the three elements are, we're going to talk about what the consequences are of a contract not meeting, or in a purported agreement not meeting the certainty requirement. So we'll look at whether an offending term can be severed and an agreement can be found otherwise, or whether the term itself can be waived and what the consequences are. So in the next video, I'm going to move on and start talking about whether or not a term is complete and what that means, or whether an arrangement is complete and what that means. So I'll see you on the other side.